first sign is not gunfire, it is silence. Across an entire city, power grids fail, streetlights flicker their last. Vox networks emit nothing but static. Astropathic communications cease without warning. One by one, every familiar reassurance of civilization is snuffed out. Then, the bodies appear. High-ranking government officials hang mangled from towering hab blocks. Military commanders are found screaming, flayed alive, nailed to the gates of their own fortresses. Entire patrols vanish without a trace, only for severed heads to appear throughout the city by morning. Every corpse has been carefully displayed. Every mutilation is a message. No contact is made, no demands are issued. Only a single, unmistakable message is left for those still alive to see it. No one is coming to save you. Long before the first drop pod slams into the ground, resistance is already facing total collapse. Panic spreads faster than any invading army ever could. Many soldiers abandon their posts, barricading themselves inside blacked-out homes. Others desperately pray that somehow they will not be noticed. This was the true genius of the Night Lords. They did not seek to destroy whole armies, they sought to destroy the will to fight. Their greatest weapon was never physical, it was fear. But the 8th Legion were never intended to become monsters. Truthfully, they once believed fear to be the most merciful weapon ever conceived. Not fear born of hatred or cruelty, but fear used as a weapon of deterrence. A single population broken by terror could spare countless others from being destroyed by war. However, that philosophy contained the seeds of its own corruption. The line between necessary brutality and outright atrocity would grow thinner with every campaign. And in time, the Legion that had once wielded fear to prevent bloodshed came to inflict unspeakable suffering, simply because it could. This is the story of the Night Lords. Every legion bears the unmistakable mark of its Primarch, but the Primarchs were not born with fully formed ideals. They too were shaped by the worlds upon which they were raised, and few were molded by a more harsh experience than Conrad Curze. His was a world where cruelty was commonplace, corruption was absolute, and fear governed every aspect of daily life. Orbiting beneath the shadow of its own moon, Nostramo existed beneath an almost eternal veil of darkness. The world was locked in a rare astronomical alignment with its celestial body, whose immense presence cast a permanent eclipse upon the planet's surface. Even before the influence of industry and pollution, Nostramo was a world where bright sunlight was a distant memory. Humanity had only worsened the curse of the world they inhabited. The air was saturated with ash, pollutants, and the stench of relentless industry, creating a world where darkness was an inescapable part of everyday existence. For the countless millions condemned to live beneath its blackened skies, each day was little different from the last. Dust and toxic smoke worked constantly into the lungs of every man, woman, and child, slowly eroding both their health and their hope. Many would spend their entire lives laboring in the endless gloom, knowing only exhaustion, violence, and a slow decline towards an inevitable early grave. On Nostramo, joy was an unfamiliar luxury. Survival itself was considered fortune. But strangely, beneath this wretched world lay unimaginable wealth. Vast natural strata of adamantium lay beneath the planet's crust, making Nostramo unimaginably wealthy. Its foundries burned without pause. Its exports hugely enriched those fortunate enough to stand at the very top of society, but for everyone else, life was beyond bleak. The overwhelming majority of the population lived in crushing poverty, laboring endlessly within the mines and manufactories, while corrupt aristocrats and criminal overlords amassed colossal fortunes above them. The distinction between nobility and organized crime had long since disappeared. Those who ruled Nostramo did not do so through justice or law, but through violence, extortion, and fear. Theft was guaranteed. Murder was commonplace. Entire districts were suffocated by the wars of rival gangs, while hired enforcers brutally maintained systems of oppression bordering upon slavery. Diseases spread rampant and unchecked through overpolluted hive cities. For many, living was a guarantee of nothing but a short lifetime of misery and suffering. It was said that every child born upon Nostramo learned the same lesson from an early age, that the only true law was the knife, and that strength alone determined who lived and who died. It was into this terrible world that Conrad Curze arrived. His arrival was as violent and unforgiving as the world that awaited him. Torn from terror and cast across the galaxy by the forces of the warp, his gestation capsule did not descend gently upon Nostramo. It struck the planet with enormous force, tearing through the towering depths of Nostramo Quintus before burrowing deep beneath the city into the planet's own crust. The impact carved a vast wound through layers of near impenetrable adamantium, eventually coming to rest close to the unstable depths of the world's core. The geological scar left behind by his arrival became a place of fear and superstition among the people of Nostramo. Even before sucking in his first polluted breath on its surface, Conrad Curze had already left his mark upon the world. Unlike some of his brothers, Curze was not discovered by a loving family, adopted by tribal chieftains, or raised within a noble court, but instead forced to climb alone through darkness, ascending from the depths of the planet until he reached the surface of a world that knew little light. He would grow up entirely alone. He had no parents to teach him compassion, no mentor to hone his extraordinary abilities. Instead, the Underhive became his teacher, shaping his entire understanding of humanity. As a feral child, Curze survived through instinct, intelligence, and violence. He hunted vermin to feed himself. He killed those who sought to prey upon him, discovering that almost immediately he possessed a strength and speed that no normal human could hope to match. Surrounded by suffering and death, he routinely endured horrors that would have broken almost anybody else. Throughout his childhood, he was plagued by strange and terrifying visions. He dreamt of wars fought upon distant worlds he had never seen, mountains of corpses, and futures consumed by bloodshed. The screams of the dying haunted both his waking hours and his fleeting sleep, while the endless cruelty surrounding him offered little reason to believe humanity was capable of anything better. Yet despite everything Nostramo had exposed him to, Curze did not become just another criminal. His world had shown that violence and selfishness ruled all things, and it would have been all too easy for one possessed of such unusual strength to simply seize power for himself, becoming another tyrant amongst a culture of countless others. Instead, he chose to wage war upon the guilty. At first, those who preyed upon the weak began to disappear. Street gangs vanished overnight. Notorious murderers were found butchered almost beyond recognition. Corrupt officials were discovered hanging from towering structures overlooking the hives. Flayed bodies were left suspended from bridges. Severed heads appeared spiked upon railings, and all without witness. Quickly, the killings became impossible to ignore, and whispers soon spread throughout Nostramo of something stalking the darkness, an unseen executioner who hunted only those guilty of terrible crimes. Some spoke of him with honor, others with hope. They called him the Night Haunter. Criminal syndicates, corrupt noble houses, and hired enforcers alike attempted to hunt him down, yet this only further helped serve his purpose. Those who went searching rarely returned. Some were deliberately allowed to live, though mutilated beyond recognition, but spared their lives, perhaps to send a message. One by one, the institutions that ruled Nostramo through fear found themselves confronted by something far more terrifying than they were. Within a single year, the transformation was extraordinary. The crime rate of the world's capital city, Nostramo Quintus, collapsed to almost nothing. The once lawless streets fell silent. Citizens imposed curfews upon themselves, terrified to remain outside after dark. Mothers warned misbehaving children that the Night Haunter would come for them should they stray from the path. Those who had once lived by violence now feared becoming its next victim. Eventually, Curze emerged from the shadows, standing before the corrupt aristocracy that had ruled Nostramo for generations. He offered them a simple choice: submit to his law, or die. Some never left the gathering, the rest knelt, and just like that, for the first time in its history, Nostramo had a single ruler. The Night Haunter became its Dark King, and his reign completely transformed the world. Justice, however brutal, was applied equally. Corruption was routed out and eliminated. Wealth became more evenly distributed. The world's already vast adamantium industry flourished beneath an administration no longer crippled by organized crime. Exports reached unprecedented levels, and districts that had once been consumed by poverty and violence became orderly and prosperous. But none of it had been achieved through trust, or hope, or forgiveness. It had been achieved through terror, and every citizen knew that the slightest transgression might bring the Night Haunter to their door. In time, Curze no longer even needed to stalk the streets himself. He simply broadcast the mutilations of those he judged guilty across the planet's communication networks. The remaining criminals surrendered. Order had finally been restored. Not through hope, not through compassion, but through absolute fear. And to Conrad Curze, that meant justice. For many, the arrival of the Emperor to their world marked the beginning of a brighter future. But for Conrad Curze, it was another event he had already seen. The vivid, traumatic visions he experienced throughout his childhood never ceased. Instead, they grew stronger. Long before the Great Crusade reached the outskirts of the Nostraman system, Curze already knew his father was coming. He had foreseen it in his dreams, just as he had foreseen so many other tragedies. By the time the Imperial fleet entered orbit, the Night Haunter stood ready to meet it. For the people of Nostramo, however, the Emperor's arrival was unlike anything they had ever experienced. A world that had existed beneath perpetual night suddenly found itself illuminated by the engines of hundreds of void ships burning overhead like artificial stars as the Emperor walked through the streets of Nostramo Quintus, surrounded by vast ranks of warriors in gleaming armor. Many among the population wept openly. Their eyes, accustomed to a lifetime of darkness, struggled to even look upon him. Those who dared gaze directly at the master of mankind were said to have been permanently blinded by his radiance. At the heart of the city, Conrad Curze waited. Accompanying the Emperor were 4 of his brothers: Rogaldorn, Lorgar, Ferrus and Fulgrim. One by one, they introduced themselves to the silent ruler of Nostramo. But Curze scarcely heard their words. Instead, each face brought on terrible visions. He saw Rogaldorn dragged down by murderers in darkness. He saw Lorgar consumed by psychic fire beneath a burning sky. He saw Ferrus already dead, his severed head held in the hand of another great warrior. Only Fulgrim appeared differently, as Curze did not immediately glimpse the terrible fate awaiting the Primarch of the Emperor's children. It was an unusual absence that would later earn Fulgrim a rare measure of Curze's respect, and in the years that followed, Fulgrim would become one of the few brothers to whom the Night Haunter was ever willing to listen, introducing him to the customs, culture, and military traditions of the Imperium. Then the Emperor himself stepped forward. Before he could even speak, another vision overwhelmed the Night Haunter with such unbearable intensity that Curze collapsed to his knees, clawing desperately at his own eyes in an attempt to escape what he was seeing. Only the Emperor's touch brought the agony to its end. When Curze finally looked up, the Master of Mankind simply said, "Be at peace, Conrad Curze. I have arrived, and I intend to take you home." Curze's reply has echoed throughout Imperial history ever since. "That is not my name, Father. My people gave me a name, and I will bear it until my dying day. And I know full well what you intend for me." Curze left Nostramo believing that he had finally found the father whose coming he had foreseen for so many years. Whether out of loyalty, resignation, or because he believed the future he had seen could not be changed, only Curze himself could ever have known. And so, with that single meeting undertaken, the destiny of both Conrad Curze and the 8th Legion became forever intertwined. Yet before Curze ever stepped foot amongst his sons, the 8th Legion already existed. To understand what the Night Lords would eventually become, we must first understand what the Emperor had initially intended for the 8th Legion to be. Long before they became known as the Night Lords, the 8th Legion already possessed a fearsome reputation. Unlike many other legions whose first recruits had been drawn from proud warrior cultures or noble bloodlines, the earliest warriors of the 8th Legion came from the lightless prison sinks buried beneath Old Terra itself. These vast subterranean warrens were places where the rule of law had long since ceased to exist. The dregs of society, condemned criminals, forgotten exiles, and generations of their descendants squabbled endlessly for survival beneath the surface of mankind's birth world. Violence was the foundation upon which life itself depended. Among those endless caverns were children born into darkness who had never seen the light of the sun. Raised amidst murder and fear, they grew pale, silent, and unnaturally comfortable in the dark. Even the hardest killers were said to avoid these children of the night, sensing something deeply unsettling in the way they moved without sound through the darkness. It was from these people that the Emperor fashioned the first warriors of the 8th. Their gene seed proved exceptionally stable among the purest of all Legionis Astartes, with little outward mutation beyond unnaturally pale skin and eyes as black as midnight. Combined with the innate traits of their Terran recruits, they became warriors perfectly adapted to fighting where others feared to tread. While other legions marched proudly beneath the light of distant suns, the 8th fought as though they still belonged to eternal night. Unlike many of their brother legions, however, the 8th were never intended to win glory through spectacular battlefield victories. The Emperor had conceived each legion to fulfill a different role in the Great Crusade, and the 8th were designed for something unique. The Great Crusade sought to reunite humanity as swiftly as possible, and every prolonged siege consumed lives, industry, and infrastructure that the Imperium ultimately wished to preserve. The 8th Legion offered another solution. Rather than destroying entire worlds through years of costly warfare, they shattered the enemy's resolve before such wars ever became necessary. Where another legion might besiege a fortress for months, the 8th would publicly execute its rulers. Where another might fight beneath every city district, the 8th would massacre a single population center with such calculated brutality that neighboring worlds surrendered without a single shot ringing into the air. The fear was never intended to be indiscriminate or malicious. It was intended to be economical. The suffering of the few was, at its core, a mercy intended to spare the lives of millions. During the closing years of the Unification Wars and the earliest days of the Great Crusade, this philosophy proved horrifyingly effective. The 8th earned a fearsome reputation as the Emperor's judgment. When a non-compliant world was deemed too dangerous or too rebellious to be reasoned with, the 8th was sent to issue their punishment. Often, word that the Legion had been assigned to a campaign was enough to bring entire rogue populations back into neat compliance before the first void ship ever entered orbit. From the very beginning, they viewed justice in absolute terms. To the 8th Legion, innocence and guilty were as distinct as light and dark. There were no shades of grey, no degrees of culpability. Those who willingly preyed upon the weak or defiled the Emperor's law had surrendered any claim to mercy. Punishment existed not to reform them, but to ensure that no one else would ever choose to follow the same path. There was, however, a profound irony at the heart of the Legion's existence. Its warriors were creatures of darkness, born to hunt monsters in the shadows, fighting to build an imperium where such monsters could no longer exist. They waged a brutal war for a future that, if the Emperor's dream was ever realized, would truly have no place for them. Yet before Conrad Curze's rediscovery, the Legion occupied an uncomfortable place among their brothers. Many regarded them as a necessary evil, weapons to be unleashed only when even more honorable solutions had failed. They seized victories, but rarely admiration. In those early years, the 8th marched beneath a shadow that seemed to set them apart from the rest of the Emperor's sons. When Conrad Curze finally assumed command of the Legion, he did not fundamentally alter its purpose. Instead, he gave it a philosophy. Renaming them the Night Lords, Curze transformed the Eighth into a perfect reflection of everything he had learned upon Nostramo. Under his leadership, they became colder, more disciplined, and utterly uncompromising. Their appearance became as much a weapon as their bolters. Armor was draped with flayed skin, skeletal trophies, snarling fanged helms, and jagged lightning motifs, each intended to terrify an enemy long before the battle began. Yet beneath this horrific spectacle remained the same central belief. Fear was never supposed to be the objective. Fear was the means by which bloodshed could be prevented. The Legion's campaigns soon developed a familiar pattern. Rather than wage long wars of attrition, the Night Lords descended upon a single city, fortress, or population center with overwhelming brutality. Entire districts were butchered. The survivors were deliberately allowed to flee. Then an offer was made. One single offer. The methods employed to achieve this reputation were deliberately theatrical. Governors who resisted were publicly executed and their remains displayed for their people to see. Military commanders disappeared from fortified capitals, only to be discovered skinned alive. Entire ruling councils were crucified above city gates. In some campaigns, captured officials were tortured over open vox frequencies for days. Every scream broadcast continually until surrender terms were accepted. Elsewhere, mutilated corpses rained from low-flying gunships into dense population centers, ensuring that every citizen understood precisely what awaited continued resistance. Populations awoke to find the streets lined with freshly flayed corpses. Others discovered thousands of severed heads arranged into grisly monuments visible for miles. Every horror served the same purpose: to convince the living that resistance was hopeless. To almost every other legion, these methods were abhorrent. To Curze, they were mathematics. To him, fear was justice. If the terror inflicted upon thousands spared the lives of millions, then mercy did not lie in kindness. It lay in ensuring that no one would ever dare to rebel a second time. Sadly, while the Night Lords were bringing worlds into compliance across the galaxy, the foundations beneath them were already beginning to crumble. The moment that Curze departed Nostramo, the piece that he had built began to unravel. The fear that kept the planet obedient had depended entirely upon his presence. Without the Night Haunter stalking its streets, old habits quickly returned. Corruption resurfaced, criminal syndicates rebuilt their power, and violence once again became the currency of survival. Before long, Nostramo was no longer sending the finest of its disciplined youths as aspirants to reinforce the Legion. It was instead sending the very sort of men Curze had once hunted. Murderers, gang leaders, sadists, the vilest dregs of Nostraman society, now gifted the physical might of the Adeptus Astartes. The poison that had once consumed Nostramo had now begun to seep into the Legion itself. Many would later argue that this was the moment the Eighth's original purpose began to rot. The Night Lords had once believed terror existed to preserve order, but increasingly, many among their ranks seemed interested only in the terror itself. Curze recognized the change almost immediately and came to despise many of his own sons. Unlike their Primarch, these new Night Lords possessed none of the tortured belief that terror served a purpose beyond itself. They delighted in suffering for its own sake. Terror was no longer the means to preserve order. It had become a reward. They killed not because it was necessary, but because they enjoyed it. As the Legion's methods became increasingly sadistic, Curze's fellow Primarchs grew steadily more and more uneasy. The 8th Legion had always been feared, but now, even those fighting alongside them began to question whether they had become a little different from the monsters they had been created to destroy. At the same time, Curze himself was beginning to fall apart. The visions that had haunted him since childhood became more frequent and more vivid. He repeatedly foresaw not only his own death, but a future in which brother would turn upon brother, the Imperium would descend into civil war, and everything the Emperor had built would burn. Unlike others gifted with foresight, Curze never believed these visions represented only potential futures that could still be changed. To him, they were inevitable certainties. Believing the future to be concretely fixed, he gradually abandoned any hope of preventing it. His fatalism slowly gave way to resignation, and resignation became apathy. Rather than halt his legion's descent into barbarity, he simply watched it happen. But despite his increasingly isolated nature, Curze did attempt to confide in one of his brothers. Following the long and bloody pacification of the Charon system, he sought out Fulgrim, one of the few brothers with whom he had ever shared any measure of trust. In strict confidence, he revealed the terrible visions tormenting him. He spoke of his own death, of Primarchs warring against one another, of the darkness he believed would ultimately consume the Imperium. Fulgrim, deeply disturbed and fearing for his brother's sanity, broke Curze's confidence by sharing these dark prophecies with Rogal Dorn. Enraged by what he had heard, Dorn confronted Curze alone in his private quarters. Precisely what words were exchanged remains lost, but the confrontation triggered a psychological break. The Night Haunter snapped, erupting into a violent assault that left the Praetorian of Terror gravely wounded. His armor rent open by massive claw marks, great gouges of flesh torn from his body. Standing above him was Conrad Curze, overcome not with triumph, but with grief. This was no ordinary quarrel between brothers. Long before the Horus Heresy plunged the Imperium into civil war, one Primarch had already turned violence against another. In retrospect, it was a grim foreshadowing of what was to come. Racked by guilt, Curze submitted to confinement while his brothers debated his fate, though his imprisonment would be short-lived. Before a verdict could be rendered, he escaped from his cell, slaughtering the formidable honor guard assigned to watch him before vanishing into the void alongside his legion. The Night Haunter's first destination after the escape was home. News had already reached him that Nostramo had fallen completely back into corruption. The criminal dynasties had reclaimed power, violence once again ruled the streets, and the world continued sending its worst sons to replenish the Night Lord's ranks. To Curze, this was yet more proof that everything he had foreseen was inevitably coming to pass. For years he had been haunted by one vision above almost all others. Again and again, he saw Nostramo split apart by a spear of light descending from the heavens. Or another man might have struggled against such a future, Curze instead chose to fulfill it. The Night Lord's fleet translated into orbit above their rotten homeworld. Without warning, their lance batteries opened fire into the hole in the planet's surface, led by Curze's own arrival upon Nostramo decades earlier. The bombardment pierced deep into the world's unstable core. Moments later, the planet began to tear itself apart. Cities collapsed, engulfed by fire. Continents cracked open, and within minutes, the notorious world that had shaped Conrad Curze ceased to exist. Officially, during the time of the Great Crusade, a Primarch possessed the authority to destroy an Imperial world if he deemed such an act necessary. Curze no longer saw Nostramo as just his homeworld, but as the source of everything terrible his legion had become. It had supplied him with generation after generation of killers and sadists who had twisted his legion beyond recognition. Having come to despise many of his own sons, Curze judged that the only sentence left for the world that had created them was death. In destroying Nostramo, he believed he was finally severing the legion from the poison that had corrupted it. But there was a bitter irony to the planet's fate. Curze had spent years proving that fear could impose order, but the moment that he departed, that order had disintegrated. The society he had built relied so completely upon his presence that it could not survive without him. The destruction of Nostramo finally forced the Imperium to confront the reality of what the Night Lords had become. Their methods had long attracted criticism, their massacres were well known, and concern over Curze's growing instability had spread amongst his brother Primarchs. But fearing what they might unleash upon the galaxy if they forced Curze's hand, the Imperium hesitated to take decisive action. Some accounts claim that Curze and the Night Lords were recalled to Terra, where they were reprimanded by the Emperor. Others suggest that the Legion simply disappeared into the distant reaches of the Great Crusade, continuing their campaigns beyond the scrutiny of Imperial authorities. Ultimately, the reason for their continued service was simple, but uncomfortable. The Night Lords were still achieving what they had been created to do. Their reputation alone could bring rebellious worlds into compliance. Governors crushed their own rebellions, paid their tithes and purged suspected traitors before the 8th Legion ever reached their borders. Entire systems surrendered rather than face their arrival. The Imperium had created the ultimate weapon of terror, and despite everything, that weapon had proven far too effective to eliminate. But with every victory won through fear, the distinction between cruelty and outright atrocity became harder to define. The Night Lords were created as an instrument of Imperial justice, but they were now becoming something far darker. And by the time the Imperium finally understood, it was far too late. By the time the Horus Heresy erupted, the Night Lords were already a brotherhood deep into decline. Exactly why Curze chose to side with Horus remains uncertain. Even Imperial historians cannot say with confidence. Unlike Mortarion, Magnus, or Angron, Curze was never seduced by promises of power, nor did he seek the favor of the Chaos Gods. Neither did he share Horus's dream of ruling a new Imperium. Instead, he viewed the Emperor's Imperium as hypocritical, condemning the Night Lords for employing the very brutality upon which it itself had been built. The Night Lords' betrayal would be cemented at Istvan V, when the Emperor dispatched 7 legions to destroy Horus upon the black sands of the Urgal Depression. The Night Lords initially arrived as part of the second wave of reinforcements, appearing every bit the loyal sons they had once been. Only once the signal was given did they reveal their true allegiance, turning their guns upon the unsuspecting Raven Guards, Salamanders, and Iron Hands in one of the greatest acts of treachery in Imperial history. Before the battle commenced, the commanders of the traitor legions had gathered aboard Lorgar's flagship to swear themselves openly to Horus's cause. As the assembled warriors proclaimed their rejection of the Emperor, it was first Captain Sevatarion who first uttered the words that would echo across 10,000 years of war to come. Death to the false Emperor. For the Night Lords themselves, however, Istvan was not their defining campaign. Their story would unfold far from the black sands of that doomed world. As the heresy spread across the galaxy, Horus immediately recognized the immense strategic value of the Night Lords' unique methods. Rather than committing the 8th to the largest set-piece battles of the rebellion, the Warmaster frequently unleashed them ahead of his advancing armies. Entire star systems were brought into compliance through Terra long before the main strength of the traitor host arrived. It was the same philosophy that had guided the Night Lords during the Great Crusade, but stripped of the moral purpose that had once, however tenuously, restrained it. Many of the older Terran veterans, along with the surviving early Nostraman recruits who remembered the Legion's original purpose, continued to wage war with the cold discipline that had carried them through the Great Crusade. Their methods remained brutal, but they still believed that Terra existed to achieve a strategic objective. Increasingly, however, they found themselves serving alongside the younger warriors, who reveled in bloodshed for its own sadistic satisfaction. As the Legion traveled across the northern reaches of the Imperium, its campaigns grew steadily more indiscriminate. Entire populations were subject to unspeakably grotesque displays of violence that served no meaningful strategic purpose beyond inspiring further terror. It was cruelty inflicted for cruelty's sake. Few recognized this decay more clearly than the Primarch. By now, he regarded many of his sons with outright open contempt and hostility, viewing them not as instruments of justice, but as degenerates. Common murderers who had greedily inherited his capacity for violence while abandoning the guiding convictions that had once given it purpose. He had destroyed Nostramo, hoping to stem the flow of corruption into his legion, but the poison had already taken root, and Curze became increasingly isolated from his gene sons. His worsening visions only accelerated his decline. Before Horus's crusade reached Terra, the Night Lords had already been fighting a quiet war amongst themselves. it was not a conflict of open rebellion, but one of irreconcilable beliefs. One faction still remembered a legion that had once seen itself as the Emperor's terrible but necessary weapon. The other had abandoned that purpose entirely. Warbands argued over the fate of captives. Veterans refused the excesses of younger captains. Brothers who had once fought side by side now viewed each other with open disdain. The Night Lords were still marching beneath a single banner, but they were no longer a single unified legion. By the time the legion departed for the Eastern Fringe, that internal fracture was reaching a boiling point. It was there, however, that Horus assigned the Night Lords one of the most important strategic objectives of the entire Heresy. While the Warmaster prepared his final advance towards Terra, the Dark Angels remained one of the greatest threats to his campaign. The First Legion possessed enormous military strength, and if allowed to reinforce the Emperor, could seriously threaten Horus's plans. To prevent this, the Night Lords were ordered to engage a war across the Thramas sector, tying down Lionel Johnson and his sons in a prolonged campaign far from the throne world. The resulting conflict, known as the Thramas Crusade, would consume almost 3 years of the Heresy, keeping one of the Imperium's most powerful legions away from Terra. Unlike many of the vast engagements fought elsewhere in the galaxy, Thramas became a savage contest between two legions whose methods could scarcely have been more different. The Dark Angels sought decisive victories through discipline, coordination, and overwhelming force. The Night Lords answered with ambushes, raids, and psychological warfare, striking isolated targets before vanishing back into the void. At the center of the conflict stood two brothers who had never truly understood one another. Lionel Johnson represented everything Curze believed the Imperium was pretending to be. Noble, honorable, unwavering. Curze, in turn, embodied everything the Lion believed should never have existed within the Emperor's grand design. Their rivalry quickly became deeply personal, leading to repeated confrontations that left devastation wherever they met. Despite his deteriorating sanity, Curze remained, as he had always been, one of the most physically dangerous combatants among the Primarchs. His gift of precognition allowed him to anticipate attacks moments before they occurred, making him an exceptionally difficult opponent to overcome in single combat. Throughout the Heresy, he crossed blades with some of the greatest warriors in the Imperium, including Vulcan, Guilliman, Sanguinius, and of course Lionel Johnson, surviving encounters that should have claimed the life of almost any other Primarch. Despite his growing madness, the military genius that had once led the 8th Legion during the Great Crusade had never entirely disappeared. Thramas demonstrated both the Night Lords' greatest strength and their fatal weakness. They could still outfight, outmaneuver, and outthink many of the Imperium's finest commanders. What they could no longer do was hold themselves together. The Night Lords could not outfight the First Legion forever. As the campaign drew near its end, the Dark Angels gradually regained the initiative, and Curze vanished into the wider war following his final confrontations with the Lion. Whatever fragile cohesion the 8th had still possessed finally collapsed. Without their Primarch, the Night Lords ceased to function as a unified legion. Existing rivalries erupted into open division as fleets, companies, and captains scattered across the galaxy, each pursuing their own ambitions. Some continued to fight for Horus, others turned to piracy and plunder, while many simply existed for their own survival. The force that had once brought entire worlds to heel through disciplined terror had shattered into countless independent warbands. The Horus Heresy eventually came to its inevitable conclusion. Horus was slain aboard the Vengeful Spirit, and as the Imperium descended into the bloody retribution of the Scouring, surviving fragments of the Night Lords drifted back to the Eastern Fringe. Here, they gathered once more around their Primarch at Sagielsa, the dark fortress world he had established during the height of the Imperium's civil war. Unlike many of his fellow traitor Primarchs, he did not seek ascension to demonhood, nor did he flee into the Eye of Terror to carve out a kingdom of his own. Instead, he waited for the personal ending he had anticipated for so many years. When the Emperor eventually passed judgment upon his wayward son, a Calidus assassin named Mushen was dispatched to infiltrate the fortress and carry out his execution. Curze knew she was coming. He had foreseen her arrival long before she ever reached the planet. His legion could easily have intercepted or killed her, but he forbade them from interfering. Defenses remained silent as the assassin passed deeper into the dark fortress. Chamber after chamber lay undisturbed before her. No alarm sounded, no warriors barred her path, until she stood face to face before the Night Haunter. Curze made no attempt to escape. Instead, he accepted his death willingly, convinced that the Emperor's decision to send an assassin would vindicate everything he had believed throughout his life. The Primarch had always maintained that fear and death were legitimate instruments of justice, and in his final moments, believed the Emperor had unknowingly proven him right. Having condemned the Night Lord's methods for decades, the Master of Mankind had ultimately answered his wayward son with judgment delivered through the blade of an executioner. In doing so, the Emperor had punished him exactly as Curze believed criminals should be punished. In death, he believed he finally exposed his father's hypocrisy and justified the path he had walked for so many years. However, that conclusion rested upon the same fatal assumption that had haunted him since childhood. His unshakable belief that his visions revealed an unchangeable future. Prophecy ceased to be a warning, and instead became an instruction. This is the true tragedy of Conrad Curze. His downfall was not inevitable because he foresaw it. It became inevitable because, little by little, he acted to fulfill it. In the end, the Night Haunter did not just witness his ultimate fate, he spent a lifetime orchestrating it. Yet even in death, Conrad Curze's final lesson would go unheeded. Curze had forbidden his legion from interfering with the assassin or seeking vengeance once the deed was done. His death, he believed, had to remain an unchallenged statement. But by then, the Night Lords were no longer under his control. Among those who refused to accept his final command was apothecary Talos Valkyran, later known throughout the 41st millennium as the Soul Hunter and one of the Legion's most renowned champions. Driven by undying loyalty to his fallen Primarch, Talos pursued the assassin after she fled, carrying Curze's severed head and several Legion relics as proof of her mission's success. Though she managed to escape the planet with her grim trophy, Talos pursued her vessel into the void. When he finally caught her, the assassin was ruthlessly butchered. The Soul Hunter recovered his Primarch's remains and reclaimed the stolen relics before they could reach Terra. In doing so, he had directly violated the last order the Night Haunter ever gave his sons. The irony could scarcely be greater. Curze had spent his life believing fear could impose absolute obedience, yet the final command he ever issued was ignored almost immediately and by his own sons. The Legion he had created no longer sought justice as he understood it, nor did it follow the philosophy he had devoted his life to proving. Even so, the Imperium received the proof it required. A final transmission from the assassin's armor reached Terra, confirming the Night Haunter's death. The Primarch of the once great 8th Legion had been permanently removed from the galactic chessboard. 10,000 years have passed since the Horus Heresy, and to describe the Night Lords of the 41st millennium as a single legion is, in many ways, misleading. Unlike the Death Guard who remain united beneath Mortarion, or the Thousand Suns whose fortunes are still guided by Magnus the Red, the Night Lords possess no central authority. There is no Primarch to rally behind, and no grand design binding them together. Instead, the 8th survives as hundreds of independent warbands scattered throughout the Eye of Terror and beyond. Some number only a handful of warriors, while others have grown into formidable pirate fleets capable of threatening entire sectors. Many exist as raiders, mercenaries, or reavers, selling their blades to other servants of chaos in exchange for plunder, slaves, or the opportunity to prey upon the weak. Others wage war entirely for themselves, recognizing no master beyond the strength of their own leader. Alliances between warbands are often temporary, ending the moment ambition, greed, or simple convenience dictates betrayal. Survival rather than unity has become the surviving characteristic of the Legion. This fragmentation has produced another quality which makes the Night Lords unlike almost any other traitor legion. Although they are counted among the servants of chaos, their relationship with the ruinous powers is remarkably distant. Many Night Lords bear the mutations that inevitably accompany 10,000 years spent within the Eye of Terror, while others willingly fight alongside demons or the devoted followers of the Chaos Gods wherever it serves their interest. Yet just as many regard such corruption with open contempt. To a Night Lord, kneeling before a god is simply another form of slavery. Where the World Eaters surrender themselves to Khorne's bloodlust, the Death Guard embrace the gifts of Nurgle, the Emperor's children are consumed by the excess of Slaanesh, and the Thousand Sons pursue the favor of Tzeentch, many Night Lords see such devotion as weakness. They did not turn against the Emperor in pursuit of divine ascension, nor because they wished to replace one faith with another. Their rebellion began as hatred for the Imperium itself, and for many that motivation remains enough. As a result, there is no single philosophy that binds the Legion's surviving warbands. Some have descended fully into chaos worship, their armor and bodies twisted beyond recognition by the warp. Others reject mutation wherever possible, clinging to the belief that dependence upon the gods represents the ultimate surrender of personal strength. Both can be found fighting beneath the icon of the winged skull, often side by side, despite holding fundamentally different beliefs about the powers they employ. There is, however, one remaining quality that truly binds the Night Lords together, though it is not religion, loyalty, or brotherhood. It is a shared understanding of fear. Even after 10,000 years, they still cultivate the appearance of living nightmares. Their midnight blue armor is adorned with crackling lightning, echoing the storms of Nostramo, while chains, skulls, and flayed skin hang from their war gear, grisly trophies harvested from previous victims. Yet beneath this terrifying appearance lies the reality of a legion that has spent millennia surviving through piracy and scavenging. Few suits of armor remain complete. Loyalist and traitor components are routinely stripped from fallen space marines and incorporated into battered, mismatched plate. They are a legion that endures not through industry or supply, but by taking what it needs from the dead. This reality shapes the way that the Night Lords wage war. They have little interest in honorable battles or glorious last stands. Instead, they still rely upon ruthless psychological warfare, stealth, and carefully planned hit-and-run ambushes. But it all comes back to fear. Where the descendants of Curze strike, Vox frequencies still fill with distorted screams and the desperate pleas of captured victims. Entire districts still lose power without warning, plunging defenders into darkness. Mutilated corpses are still suspended from walls and draped across city streets. Panic still becomes contagious. Rather than meeting the enemy head-on, the Night Lords stalk the edges of the battlefield. They isolate reconnaissance teams, supply convoys, and retreating formations before overwhelming them with sudden violence. They appear from the darkness just long enough to be seen before melting away once more, repeating the process again and again until exhaustion, paranoia, and terror have broken organized resistance. What follows is rarely a battle, it is more of an execution. Many warbands specialize in overwhelming area assaults led by raptors. Some even unleash demonic warp talons, whose screaming descent from the night sky has become one of the Legion's most infamous tactics. Chainsaws roar, lightning claws crackle, tearing apart isolated defenders before disappearing as suddenly as they arrived. Even when forced into open combat, there is no concept of martial honor. They will exploit any weakness, spring any trap, and seize any unfair advantage that increases their chances of survival. To the Night Lords, there is no such thing as a fair fight. The Night Lords were never the strongest legion, nor the most numerous, and they are hardly devoted servants of chaos. But what made them unique was an idea. They once believed fear could accomplish what armies could not, that terror, however dreadful, could end wars before they began, that the suffering of the few could spare the lives of the many. They were among the least compassionate of the Emperor's sons, yet perhaps, in their own twisted way, the most merciful legion he ever created. For a time, on the dark streets of Nostramo and during the early years of the Great Crusade, their beliefs even appeared to work, but ideas are fragile things. Little by little, the purpose behind the terror was forgotten. Justice became vengeance, vengeance became cruelty, and eventually, cruelty no longer required any justification at all. The true downfall of the Night Lords was the corruption of the very philosophy upon which they had been created. And so, when the lights go out, when the Vox falls silent, when the bodies begin to appear, remember this story and pray that they have only come to make examples of someone else.